On July 10th, the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign hosted a meeting at which Simon Pirani spoke on the issue of the situation in Donbass and Crimea and Russia's intervention there in 2014 as a prelude to Russia's invasion at the present time. There was a little bit of controversy in the discussion, and this edited version of that meeting focuses on that controversy. And I would say that points of difference and controversy and debate always bring out either the worst or the best in people. In this case, I think it brought out the best, and it certainly made for a more interesting discussion. We have also posted the full-length video of that meeting for people that want to watch that. There's also a transcript of this edited version that is available.
Today. So this is a forum sponsored by the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Committee. If you found your way here, you've probably seen our Facebook page. If not, we have a Facebook page and it has our points of unity on it and a lot of other things. In a few weeks, we're going to be having another speaker event like this one online that will be talking about the influence of fascist ideas in the left and how it's come to be that the majority of the left, especially the socialist left in the world, is on the wrong side of history in regards to Ukraine.
There we are. What I'm going to do, I can see in front of me a knowledgeable audience. So I think probably, you know, what we can usefully do here is I'll speak about 7 points that relate to the theme I was asked to speak about. And that, I'll tell you what they are, and then I'm going to run through them, and then, you know, we'll have more time for discussion. They are Ukraine as Russia's oldest colony. Secondly, the character of the Maidan movement in 2014. Thirdly, what was going on in Southeast Ukraine before and during 2014. Fourthly, the Russian occupation of Crimea and Donbass. Fifthly, a bit about the international context. And sixthly, the short-term causes of the new phase of the war. And seventh, just some thoughts about what the national question means in the 21st century. Yeah, if you think I've left something out already, then say so in the chat. I'll try and deal with it. So I'm just going to run through those points. The first, about Ukraine being Russia's oldest colony, I think has to be borne in mind in order to understand what's happening now. 19th century, under the Russian Empire, restrictions on language, subordination to imperial institutions, the form of land ownership was Russian dominated. Imperial institution that mattered most to many peasant families was army conscription. So of course, huge numbers of Ukrainians in the Russian army that fell to pieces during the course of 1917. In 1917, the declaration of the Ukrainian Republic preceded the Bolshevik seizure of power. So during 1917, in the middle of 1917, I think it was June, a Ukrainian Republic was declared in defiance of the Russian Empire, or rather, well, the Russian Empire had gone, but in defiance of Russian imperial traditions, which remained strong. This provoked a huge crisis in the provisional government in Russia, and this government, for much of its existence, was led by left social democrats. Nevertheless, the Bolsheviks had no hesitation in organizing to defeat it militarily and to encourage Russian-speaking workers who were brought down to eastern Ukraine in quite large numbers at that time with the start of the iron and steel industry, to encourage those Russian-speaking workers to oppose the formation of the independent Ukrainian institutions. I cannot recommend too highly the book by Marco Boyson about the working class and the national question in the revolution in the period from the 1890s up until 1918. It's a magnificent piece of scholarship by a Marxist of our generation. I mean, unfortunately, I think that one is expensive, and I don't know that any pirate PDFs are knocking about on the internet. But you know, if you're a member of a university library or whatever, it's really essential reading to my mind. Now, the fact that Ukraine was the Russian Empire's most important colony, remains significant through the Soviet period. And indeed, Soviet policy in the 1920s was actually very strongly in favor of the Ukrainian language. Ukrainian language was obligatory at levels of government in Ukraine. There were arguments which were never resolved about the extent of independence that the Ukrainian Republic would be allowed within the Soviet Union. But there was an understanding of national rights, which included that language law, which I think it'd be really interesting to compare that to the language law of 2018, which is being denounced by every Stalinist and Putinist under the sun. I think in many respects, the one in 1920s was a little stronger. And I know that, for example, to work in any government position, you had to take a Ukrainian language test, and it was a written test, and people would come and check on you. So there was a real fight on that, and that policy was reversed in the mid 1930s. And at the end of the USSR, we should recall that following the big miners' strikes of 1989 and 1990, there was then again a resurgence of national and nationalist movements in many of the Soviet republics, and none more so than Ukraine. They had this huge human chain across the whole country. This was certainly fundamental in leading to the end of the USSR. So disentangling these national and class questions has never been simple. And I suppose for reasons I'll say in the last bit of what I talk about, I mean, I for many years thought that you know, the national question in many ways was receding from importance in the 21st century. And I must say the events of the last few months have made me rethink that. Okay, so going on to the second point, which is the character of the Maidan uprising in 2014. The Maidan uprising was preceded, of course, by the Orange Revolution of 2004. And broadly speaking, this was a movement in support of democratic rights. Specifically, it concerned the organized rigging of the presidential election. So if we think back to that time, Ukraine had developed a system of financial industrial groups based on property taken out of or partly out of state ownership and led by oligarchs, politically influential businessmen. That's what I mean by that term. Yanukovych, who was a candidate in that election, Viktor Yanukovych, represented some of the strongest of these groups based in the east of the country, where the industrial base was. That's the iron, steel, coal, metals processing, chemicals, and so on. Now, there's no direct correlation between one particular section of industry and a group of oligarchs and the political parties, but in general, it's true that it was those eastern groups that Yanukovych represented, whereas his opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, was typical of Western-leaning bourgeois liberals in post-Soviet countries. The cause of the Orange Revolution was that people thought that, or the immediate cause of the Orange Revolution in 2004 was people thought that Yanukovych's people had tried to fix the vote, which was a common procedure in post-Soviet countries, and the outcome was a second election, and Yushchenko was declared the winner. Now, there were issues of free speech. There were social issues that played into this as well. And there was the issue which became much bigger in 2014 of the orientation towards Europe. Many working class Ukrainians supported this orientation. I'm a bit sick of reading in Western left-wing papers about how this was just a matter of the Ukrainian bourgeoisie. I think that's an oversimplification. And the reason was that millions and millions of Ukrainians were working in Western Europe by this time. There was huge migration. I mean, I remember on when the Orange Revolution broke out in 2004, I happened to be visiting my daughter who was studying in Madrid. And we got on the metro in Madrid, and there were all these people dressed in Ukrainian colors, orange colors, going to a demonstration at the Ukrainian embassy. And I just went up and chatted to them. And I mean, what really struck me, and I'm going to throw these vignettes at you. So I'm not building a whole theory on a conversation in the metro, but I just kind of think this was interesting. What was interesting was, you know, they were not your typical East European migrants who are young and single, right? They were families, and they were on a family outing in their orange colors, and off they were going to the embassy. And the significance of that is families, that means you've moved there for quite a time. It's a different type of migration. So, and I think that, you know, that shared belief that working in Europe was a better deal for working class Ukrainians than working at home in Ukraine was in the background of these events. Now, of course, there was tension rising between the Ukrainian bourgeoisie and the Russian bourgeoisie at this period. The Putin regime intensely disliked the Orange Revolution of 2004. It disliked Ukraine's turn towards Europe. And Ted kindly mentioned I worked for quite a while, 15 years at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, following the gas sector in Russia and Ukraine. And they had the so-called gas wars, which dated from this time when Russia wanted to take majority ownership of the Ukrainian pipeline system, and came pretty close to doing that several times. Once together with Shell, the oil company, and other times different versions. They did that successfully in Belarus, which is significant. They were never able to do it in Ukraine, and it got right to the point of a law being put to the Ukrainian parliament, and at the last minute, the Ukrainian parliament changed its mind. And this became an increasing source of friction. That's a big trade for Russia, as we now, this has come out and been discussed a lot this year. I'm sure you're all aware of it. That's a big trade for Russia, and having to transport the gas through Ukraine reduced Russia's room for maneuver, both economically and politically. And it's a long story about how they tried desperately to get control over that pipeline system, and that was always a bridge that the Ukrainian bourgeoisie and the Ukrainian government would not cross. Now, if we then, so if we go on from, so 2004 was the Orange Revolution. Don't forget that in 2010, there was a further presidential election when Yanukovych, the representative, as I'm arguing, of the Eastern oligarchs, was elected without apparently much fooling about with the polls, was elected, and that election was accepted all round as being legitimate as the president. So from 2010, he was the president. And of course, he was presiding over an economic disaster for Ukraine that arose from the 2008-9 crisis. Living standards, which have been very low in the 1990s, lower in most respects than in Russia, and better into the 2000s. The steel industry recovered, agricultural exports recovered, and much of this crashed again. The discussion about the move towards Europe took place under Yanukovych's presidency, And in fact, the trigger for the Maidan uprising, I would call it, I mean, it depends how you count, but there were two triggers in a way. The first was that Yanukovych's people had negotiated an association agreement with the EU. The Russians didn't like it. They had tried to stop it, and did stop it at the last minute by effectively making Yanukovych's people a better cash offer in terms of the interstate relationship. And students went out and demonstrated. Nothing unusual there. The second trigger that turned that into a really mass movement was the police going out and beating the hell out of these students. That was what really turned it from simply a protest on this Europe issue to a much broader uprising, which eventually brought Yanukovych down. So I suppose the conclusion there is to argue, and because this comes up again and again in the arguments about the character of the current war and the character of the Ukrainian government, is what I want to say is that there were all sorts of social issues feeding into the uprising in 2014. Now, I'll just make this point, Lisa, but I see you have your hand up, but let me just make this point, that when that uprising takes on this mass form, it does involve not only a huge proportion of the population, but also a huge range of political forces, from our friends in the socialist, radical socialist and anarchist organizations through to the fascists. And there's no doubt in my mind that it was the fascists and the ultranationalists who were the best organized and the best armed during that uprising, the so-called Maidan revolution. They used the occasion to get arms. Don't forget that the authority of the police collapsed across the country. So this was an opportunity for people, and the fascists were most organized about it, to get their hands on guns in many different locations outside of Kiev, as well as in Kiev itself. Nevertheless, the stuff about it being a so-called fascist coup, which we hear from people in the Stop the War coalition here, and you no doubt hear it over that side of the Atlantic, is, I mean, apart from, there's a political point to it from their point of view. They're trying to prove a political point about Ukraine being everlastingly fascist, but from an analytical point of view, it's just stupid. It doesn't mean anything. And even the Kremlin, of course, wasn't using that terminology in 2014, as far as I know. Lisa, do you want to ask a quick question, or shall I keep going?
Keep going, Simon. She'll
Okay.
get a chance to speak after you're finished.
Cool. Okay. So the third point is about Southeast Ukraine in the period between 2010 and 2014. So at that time, Yanukovych was the president, and the Party of Regions, which was his party, was the largest party in parliament, well known for its incredible corruption. And I mean, I'm using that word in the sense of a model of capitalism whereby political influence enables you to access extraordinary revenues, which can be creamed off from the economy in certain ways. I think that in that sense, it's a model similar to the model that we saw in Russia at that time. And there's also no doubt that that party had, to some extent, support, at least in terms of votes, from working class people in Eastern Ukraine. So, you would read in the papers or hear on the television, Donbass is subsidizing the rest of Ukraine. We're doing all the work. You guys are dining out on it, and so on and so on. And there's no doubt in my mind that working class people responded to these arguments. And I think those arguments on the one hand, and nervousness about the increasingly strident tone of Ukrainian nationalism on the other hand, fed into the mood in southeast Ukraine for in 2014, and the support or support on the one hand and acceptance on the other hand of the right-wing revolt by elements in the Party of Regions, which was fed into the separatist movement. I think these are subjects of huge controversy among friends and comrades and colleagues in Ukraine. My understanding, and I have to say I'm not an expert researcher of Ukrainian social issues or political issues. I mean, obviously I follow this stuff as closely as I can, and I was traveling until the pandemic regularly to Ukraine and Russia. But my understanding is that, if you want to get down to the survey evidence showed in 2014 strong support in southeastern Ukraine for autonomy, different models of autonomy, and little support for separation. And of course, there are separatist elements, and there are the extreme Russian nationalists who are active there at the time. I would sum up the thing by saying that a conflict which was a civil conflict turned into a military conflict in 2014, primarily because of the military intervention of Russian fascists and extreme nationalists and the Russian army. Those are the forces that turned it into a military conflict. I think to pretend that everything would have been fine if they hadn't turned up is an exaggeration. Obviously, there was, there were huge tensions there as a result of years of this political playing on these themes by Yanukovych and his allies. But I think what turns it into a military conflict very clearly is the intervention of the Russian army and these irregulars, volunteer forces that fought alongside them. And if we think about the catalogue of events, so the Crimea was annexed very, very soon after the departure of Yanukovych. So these huge demonstrations in Kiev, the collapse of the police force across the country leads to the departure of Yanukovych. Off he goes to Russia with his closest people. I've just been reading this book, which is a great journalistic account of the development of the offshore financial system by Oliver Bullough called Moneyland. I strongly recommend it. He's a very good journalist, and he starts with the example of Yanukovych's own personal wealth, which is pretty impressive. And he sort of follows the money and develops his argument there about the offshore and the financial system. Right, moving on. So Crimea was annexed. There's an immediate crackdown on all types of pro-Ukrainian and socialist activists there, and the Crimean Tatars and their organizations particularly. And that's followed by the military conflict in Donetsk and Lugansk, which leads to the formation of these republics. And I think the character of those regimes is very important. They are lawless client states of Russia. Industry was trashed. Bits of it were taken into ownership by corporations based in Ossetia, the also lawless Russian-supported enclave in Georgia. All forms of democracy, including workplace democracy, were trashed. And I mean, there's a whole history there. We can talk about that some more. Just a quick point about the well, a couple of quick points about the politics of the government-controlled part of Ukraine between 2014 and now. I mean, first of all, there's a concerted effort by the nationalists to establish this sort of new national identity. There's a decommunization law, similar to other East European countries, which I think was passed in 2017. And there's this language law, which was passed in 2018. There are critiques of all this stuff, of course, by Ukrainian socialists, but I think these need to be distinguished from the stereotypes thrown around by the Kremlin and those who repeat Kremlin propaganda. Now, a quick point about the international context. I think probably this audience is aware of most of this, but, and it's again, really, I mean, one of the articles I put in the chat was written by me in response to the stuff which we hear a lot about in the so-called left in the West about NATO expansion. So again, I mean, I think this needs to be tackled on two levels. I mean, first of all, there is an extent to which people are just recycling whatever the Kremlin is saying. But I think obviously there has been NATO expansion. So I think we need to analytically think about the way that that's happened and whether that can explain in any way what's going on now. My answer to the way that it happened is that you need to look at the economic relationship between Russia and the Western powers. Russia was reduced during the 1990s to be a secondary power economically, a supplier of raw materials, and obviously all kinds of cooperation, the offshore financial zone being a good example, were established between the Western and Russian ruling classes as the economy emerged from the 1990s slump, and on the basis of oil revenues and gas revenues and revenues from the sale of minerals and metals, the Russian economy began to get back on its feet again. Now, the main chapter of NATO expansion started before that. 1999, they had a conference where a whole lot of states were kind of put on a membership, whatever it's called, plan, and 2004, all those states had joined, which included some of the Central European states, but also the Baltic states, and who, you know, they're not Mexico, right? The imperialist power they're worrying about is not over the border in the United States. They're in the Baltic states, and therefore the imperialist power they're worrying about, which has invaded them at various times or, you know, received ownership of them thanks to secret deals between Stalin and Hitler, is Russia. So you can see the logic for the Baltic states. I mean, my understanding is that first of all, there was no membership action plan and never has been for Ukraine, ever. I mean, obviously, NATO was anxious to build up a military relationship with Ukraine. It was doing that even when Yanukovych was president, even before that. I mean, that's a long-standing thing. But the weapon supply until the last year was absolutely negligible. And the progress in terms of Ukraine moving towards membership was negligible. That was complicated by the European Union. Ukraine desperately wanted EU membership, as did Turkey, and neither of those countries was ever going to be allowed to get anywhere near that by Germany and France in particular. And yes, it's true that the Western powers did not want a strong Russian state, but it's also true that the Western powers increasingly in this period from 2000 onwards, when Putin is the president, saw Russia as a gendarme which they could use to maintain social control in the former Soviet territories. Chechnya has been mentioned, Georgia, there's the Russian attack on Georgia in 2008, but I think primarily in Syria and Ukraine. And of course, the Russian intervention in Syria came after the war in Ukraine started in 2014, but it's very clear that the message from the Western powers was you can support Bashar al-Assad you can massacre as many Syrians as you like, you can use chemical weapons, you can do everything else, but just keep away from the Western air bases in the Middle East and you will be fine. And much as they all deny that there is an arrangement with spheres of influence, that is a policy about spheres of influence. And the same was true actually with Ukraine. And it's notable that all the sanctions that were imposed on Russia after 2014 were imposed with respect to the annexation of Crimea, which was something that made the Western powers nervous and they regarded as unacceptable. There were no sanctions related to the support for the right-wing and fascist elements that were put in charge of these so-called People's Republics. Now, I'm going to be quick, and Cheryl sent me a message asking me very politely to be quick. And I've got two more bits to this. One is the short-term causes of the new phase of the war. I mean, the Minsk agreement was never going to work, right? And people who follow this more closely than I do, that's their opinion. And I, having read into it, I'm sure they're right. The agreement was that there would be a measure of autonomy and that Russian forces would withdraw. But it's not specified in so-called Minsk II which way around that's going to happen, right? So it was never going to work. And it didn't work. And Taras Belus, actually, just when the current phase of the war started, wrote a very good article. Let's try and find that and share it, explaining that as a socialist comrade in Kiev. I think that's very, very worth reading. And I think it's significant that during the last couple of years, I don't think. I mean, a lot of Ukrainians said to me, and when we're talking about very tragic and difficult things now, a lot of Ukrainians said to me in the course of March, well, we always knew this was going to happen. Not all, but a lot of people said, oh, we never thought this was going to happen. But there were some people who said, oh, we always knew this was going to happen. Well, I can tell you now, I did not know it was going to happen. But I also don't think a lot of people in the Kremlin knew it was going to happen. I don't think this was a kind of I think this was one possible option, which was obviously there for the Kremlin to take. And I think this is the way that the Kremlin operates, both in economic and in military terms, is that they keep their options open. I think Putin's extremely skilled in this respect. They keep their options open. I think this was always one option, but I don't think it was the favorite one. And I think there was much more concentration when all those Russian troops were gathering on the border. And, the US, the CIA, to be fair to them, were saying there's going to be an invasion. And I think at that point that what was definitely going to happen was something with respect to the People's Republics. They were handing out huge numbers of passports. More than 1 million passports were given out in 2021 to citizens of the Republic, so that they would be citizens of the Russian Federation. And that trick was played in Georgia, well, we're just moving our peacekeepers in to protect our citizens, that's all. And this was all going on. There were changes in the administration of those republics. There was a lot more direct Russian involvement in the administration. So all that was happening. But I think also that as a result of things that have happened in Russia, we haven't had time to speak about, the protest movements, the failure of the Kremlin to deal with those, the deteriorating condition of the economy due to, up until now, the low prices of oil that followed the 2015 crash, all sorts of other things. I think the Kremlin's domestic agenda was driving it more and more into a kind of ideological nationalism, which was, on speed, if you like. I mean, it's always been there, but it's been massively ratcheted up over the past year or so. The much more extreme forms of repression domestically, and I think it's all that plays into the decision then, which of course was a catastrophic. There was a catastrophic, from the Kremlin's point of view, underestimation of how Ukraine as a country would respond, but all that played into the decision to invade on the 24th of February. Now, I'm going to finish just very quickly this 7th point about what the national question means in the 21st century. I mean, it's more to raise a question than to tell you what my answers are, because I don't know what they are. I had for many years, I thought that the education, if you like, that I'd had as a Marxist about the issue of national liberation was wanting. And the reason I thought it was wanting more than anything was that I couldn't see any progressive role being played by the bourgeoisie in countries, whether in Latin America or in Africa, or whether bureaucratic formations like in Vietnam. Particularly, I spent a lot of time looking at the Vietnamese regime and the role, and I couldn't see any really socially progressive politics or anything to do with what I would think of socialism coming from these regimes. So I thought that the part of the schema which was prevalent in the Marxist movement in the early 20th century about the not only that nations had a right to resist colonialism, but that there was a progressive aspect to that nationalism, I thought was wrong. And I still think we've moved past that period of history. We're in the globalized form of capitalism, where empires are neo-colonialist and economic rather than direct very often. But I don't see anything progressive inherently, and I don't see very much progressive just from the evidence before our eyes of any of these national bourgeoisies that find themselves resisting colonialism. However, I mean, I think more than ever now, actually, as a result of the events of the last few months, I mean, I do think there is a right to resist, which is something that, I would embrace as part of my socialist understanding of the world. And that is not conditional, and it's not kind of, and it's not limited by the fact of whatever, however I might see the bourgeoisie in Ukraine or any other country. I mean, I think that right to resist is there for me as much in Ukraine as it is in Palestine or in Ireland, which is not a hot war, thank God. But I mean, that's something that's obviously concerned us all our lives, being involved with socialist politics in the UK. I don't see there's any, and there's plenty of reactionary politics in Ireland and plenty in Palestine, but I don't see that affects this right to resist. And that to me is a political, that's been a kind of political anchor for me over the past few months. What that says about outcomes and what that says about the course of the war is another subject really to what we're speaking about today. So I'll leave it there. And sorry for going on a bit long, and thanks for listening.
Oh, thank you very much.
This is Charles Rackless. I speak on behalf of the International Leninist Trotskyist Tendency Communist Workers Group. I think the discussion on the national question and permanent revolution is essential because, in my understanding, Lenin came around to Trotsky's permanent revolution and understood that the national bourgeoisie in the semi-colonial countries could no longer carry out the tasks of the national democratic revolution. And that therefore is necessary to combine the struggle for national liberation with the struggle for socialist revolution. And thus we raise again the position of the Bolsheviks for an independent Soviet Ukraine, and for such an independent Soviet Ukraine to actually establish the internationalist unity it needs to win. It must also recognize the right for an independent Soviet Donbass and Crimea. Then the question is also about the question of a proxy war, which really wasn't raised too much in here, and the role of the West, because much of the left has been saying that, well, Ukraine, of course, it does have the right to resist, and we argue for that in our articles. But we point out that the Ukrainian bourgeoisie is not well, let me backtrack a little bit, but that the struggle for the defeat of the Russian imperialist has to go hand in hand with the struggle against the control of Ukraine by NATO, and that semi-colonial countries, dependent countries, cannot be independent of one imperialist bloc or the other, and that because Ukraine today is a dependent proxy and puppet government of NATO, we have to point our guns as the international working class, both at NATO and at Russia, and that when we talk about the resistance, we have to put that in class terms. We can't just say abstractly that there's a patriotic front of all Ukraine that's going to defend and win Ukrainian sovereignty unless we fight for the independence of the working class in Ukraine. And of course, that's the task of the internationalist workers movement to create a workers' international. And so we need a new Zimmerwald that says we turn the inter-imperialist war into a class war. Now, many people will say, and I've heard it on many of these discussions, not with your group, with Tempest and others, et cetera, that this is not a proxy war because there's no Western boots on the ground. But I think that that gives some sort of cover to the arguments of Biden and NATO, et cetera, that, oh, we're not involved, we're just sending, some arms and we're giving a little bit of support and a little bit of intelligence. But I think that the way that wars are conducted now, the left has to be a little more aware of the nature of hybrid wars, of proxy wars, of the ability of the gangster on 12th Street to put the small gangs on 7th Street to war against their enemies on 5th Street. In other words, the United States, Western Europe have their intentions to encircle and crush Russia, or to at least control it, which to us is an inter-imperialist struggle, and that Ukraine has been thrown straight in the middle of that, and that even though there's been some discussion of the lesser role of the Nazis that rose up, and I would disagree and say that they were the ones that did the sniping in the Maidan from the earlier comment, and I think that's been documented. But that because the capitalist Ukraine was not able to meet the crisis of the economy that the people face since restoration, and I think this applies across the former Soviet republics, the national question has been reemerged. And because the capitalist governments there cannot meet the people's needs, the right-wing nationalists have a foot in, and they're able to do that and make their links with the West. And therefore, we need to assert the national program of self-determination as linked to permanent revolution. So I'm sure that's my 2 minutes, and hopefully there's a second round. Thank you.
For me, I mean, we can't get around the fact that involved in the right to resist is the right to have arms and to defend yourself with a gun. And this is one of the things that I find most, atrocious about all the calls for peace and negotiations. Again, as John mentioned, it's as if the Ukrainians have no voice of their own. It's as if they have, it's very emotional. It's as if they have no right to their own experience. When I think about the weapon of rape in Ukraine right now, which of course has been a time-tested method of war, tactic of war, and the fact that pregnant Ukrainian women are not able to get an abortion in the countries where they've had to flee to for their lives, it makes me sick. And one of the things that I would say, if I ever have a chance to say it to someone who has that position about peace, peace in Ukraine is, so if you were being raped by a Russian soldier, would you prefer to have a gun to shoot him and stop the rape of perhaps your child? Or would you call for peace, my brother? It's absurd. So in any case, I just want to make that point that you can't both ways. that the right to resist essential means the right to defend yourself with weapons and the right to get those weapons wherever you can get them from.
The perspective that the Russo-Ukraine war is analogous to Zimmerwald in 1915 in First World War is factually false. And I have no doubt that the NATO powers think they're fighting a proxy war using Ukrainians. That's their point of view. But a Marxist point of view, which of course begins with a class analysis, doesn't necessarily just simply end and stop with a class analysis, because the Russo-Ukraine war is a war formally between two capitalist powers. One is a non-imperial capitalist power, Ukraine, that has been traditionally oppressed by a neo-imperialist capitalist power, Russia. And that's the present military and war situation. And I'll just end off with a class analysis. Since we're dealing with a war between an oppressed and oppressor nations, both of them capitalist, we have to realize that the form of the conflict also involves non-class criteria. So of course we begin with a class analysis, but including that of Russia. But the limits to that involve the actual nature of the conflict as it presents itself to us in reality. So that, I'll just end there.
Just in this debate, I would argue that in this war, the inter-imperialist conflict predominates over the national war, and that if the Ukraine working class is going to survive, it has to turn its guns both against Zelensky and against NATO, as well as against Russia. And I think that's a large piece of the debate that we're having on the left. Obviously, I'm not talking about with the Putin pals. That's another discussion. But in this side of the left, that's where we have to take the debate.
Stanley's questions was about the situation of, regarding the attitude to the war here in the UK. I mean, I find it quite difficult to judge. I agree with you that the internet, which is so positive and important for those of us who believe in human society being a thing, is such a marvelous thing in many ways. It can also produce incredibly distorting impressions. And I think actually there is I think there's an enormous, the presence of those Kremlin repeating people is very, very large on the internet. But I think here in the UK, as well as in your experience, it's a bit smaller in real life. I think actually, I mean, I always poo-pooed those who said, oh, Hillary Clinton lost the election to Trump because of Russian bots. I always thought that was nonsense. And I always responded, obviously, you are all in the States, or many of you are, and you know much more about this than I do, but I always responded by saying, no, the Democratic Party lost the election because they failed to appeal to Black and working class voters, and you can't blame it on Russian bots. However, I mean, I do think that Kremlin propaganda is a thing, and and one of the things I want to say in response to this discussion, I mean, we have to, there are real points of substance and real points of analysis, but also we're conducting a discussion about those under conditions where there's just, and it is very often on the internet, an enormous weight, both of Kremlin propaganda, but also people who repeat it either willingly and knowingly, or not willingly or not knowingly. And I think that's a problem we have to live with. The other thing I'd say about the solidarity activity here, and this is a bit of advertising, if you'll excuse me, there, I've put in the chat, that's a link to a thing that I personally have been involved in, which I think is one of the forms of solidarity that can truly be effective. because in the first couple of months, everybody here, lots of people here went on demonstrations. I think ordinary working class people here, by and large, very, very sympathetic to Ukraine, and ready to take refugees into their homes, all sorts of other measures by which you can see that, just seeing the reaction to the arrival of refugees here in London, and lots of other small things. But when we get past that initial thing, and I think the war is going to drag on, I think that's a very likely scenario. I've been working with other friends to highlight what's going on in the areas that are occupied by Russia, and to try to devise forms of solidarity with the labor movement and with civil society in those areas. What do we do in response to a problem? Of course, we have a Zoom call. And in fact, we had two. We had one last Monday, which was great. We had a representative of a number of human rights organizations. We got a second one on Thursday, which is with the Eastern Human Rights Group, which actually just, its title doesn't really describe it fully. It's come out of the workers' movement and was set up by trade union organizers who are from parts of Donetsk and Lugansk, which are actually now they've had to move, and they come from Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and they're now based in other parts of Ukraine. Right. Okay, I'll carry on. And yeah, we got a call on Thursday. I'd invite anybody who's interested to come and listen to what those friends have to say, and we're going to try from that to devise forms of solidarity. Certainly circulating information will be one thing that we know needs doing about what's going on in the Russian occupied areas, which I think says a lot about the character of Russian imperialism and the character of the Russian war. And so it's important both from the very practical point of view, and also plays into our conversations about what is Russia doing. But just before I get onto that question, I mean, I do think there are a number of things that have come up here which I would put under the heading of, things that are said by the Kremlin and then repeated. And clearly, I'm not accusing anybody here of repeating Kremlin propaganda. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I think there are arguments that are repeatedly cycled through the left, which are actually very close to the ones that are put by the Kremlin, and clearly have some real significance in reality for that reason. I think the most serious one, and it's one that I think needs to be argued with, is this issue of is this a proxy war? And clearly there's a sense, and I agree with Bradley about this, clearly there's a sense in which, yes, it's a proxy war. Clearly there are people sitting in the US State Department, clearly there are people in Brussels, clearly there are people sitting in Whitehall here in the UK, clearly thinking how they can use this situation to the advantage of the various governments that they belong to. But if we then take that to mean that that is the guiding hand behind the Ukrainian resistance, that's obviously nonsense. I mean, the American position that was put to Zelensky in the first week of the war, it's not only is that position not aligned with the position of working class people in eastern Ukraine who went out trying to fight tanks with their bare hands, but it's not even aligned with the position of Zelensky. The position of the US State Department at the start of the war was, hello, we'll offer you government in exile. You can come here to the US, and because we expect that Russia is going to occupy Kiev. And Zelensky's response, we all know, which I think was quite an important turning point, no thanks, please send me some weapons. And he stayed where he was. And I think that was, to the extent that political actions are important in this thing, I think that was an important one. So there's no alignment between the Ukraine government on this and the American State Department. And there's lots and lots and lots of evidence that before this invasion in February and since, there are, powerful elements in the ruling class of the big Western powers. I'd say France, Germany, and Italy very openly, but also in the US. I think the ruling class is divided on this. I think they want to, I think those elements, and I think they're predominant as things stand, would like to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table sooner rather than later. And, you know, the fact that bits of Ukraine are occupied by Russia at that point is, you know, a barrier they're going to try and get over. I mean, at the moment, I don't see any way over it, because I think the level of resistance is in the way that somebody talked about, and thank you for making this point. Yeah, that I mean, there are more recruits than weapons. And in fact, I had some Ukrainian friends visiting who are liberals rather than socialists, people I know through journalism. And I mean, they were saying they're actually very worried because what happened was when they ran out of sort of army uniforms and the ability to bring people into the army, they at a certain point at the beginning of the war, they just started giving everybody guns. And now there are an enormous quantity of guns in private hands in Kiev. This was a reference to Kiev, and my friends saw it from their point of view as a big problem. You know, domestic and so on are being settled with weapons in hand. We saw this in the Balkans. This is not, you know, I think we probably see it in every war. This is not something, in my view, to celebrate or whatever. I mean, it's just what happens. But I think the problem with the proxy war thing is that it assumes that the agency here, and other people have said this on this call, that the agency is the Western powers and neither the Ukrainian government nor the Ukrainian people, whereas I'd say they are the chief agents who have been resisting this Russian invasion. I mean, just very quickly, I've got to come back. Charles said that we have to point our guns at NATO as well as at Russia. I really don't know what you're talking about. And I'm afraid this sort of loose phraseology that we hear in meetings when, I mean, let's face it, we're all sitting, or most people in this call, as far as I can see, are sitting quite comfortably in countries where there's no war going on. I think to talk about which direction we're going to point our guns in this conversation is really not helpful. And I'd say it reflects the sort of sloganizing that we've all been used to. I think I think most people here have spent many years in the movement. And that sloganizing, it doesn't have any meaning in the present situation. And likewise, I'd say to speak about an independent Soviet Donbass and Crimea, when the only versions of Donbass and Crimea that are available are these versions led by Russian government agents and fascist gangsters, I would call them, in Donetsk and Lugansk. I think that's a fair description, can be borne out by quite a lot of research. You know, it doesn't, to my mind, that's empty sloganizing and doesn't mean anything. A quick other point raised by Charles, it is not clear who did the sniping on Maidan. It just isn't clear. And there's been a huge dispute raging among academics in Canada about this. If you just go to the Twitter feeds of David Marples or Ivan Kachanovsky, they were arguing about it again yesterday. These guys spend their lives reading Ukrainian government documents and press much more than I do. It just isn't clear. So let's not say it's clear when it's not clear. There were guns all round, obviously, on Maidan. We know that. We know that the state forces were under orders to use them, and that in many cases they lost their nerve, and that was part of the reason that the state ceased to function. But yeah, let's be a little less certain where there's clearly uncertainty. Okay, so a couple of other things in the sort of category of arguments that are thrown up repeatedly by Putinists, or maybe not Putinists, just kind of people who, you know, long for the Soviet Union even 30 years after it's gone. Stanley, you asked, you know, you constantly hear the argument, well, Yanukovych was in office and it was a coup and what was the role of Victoria Nuland? I mean, I can safely say the role of Victoria Nuland was just zero. The conversation, which has been made famous via Wikimedia, is just kind of Wikipedia. What was it called? WikiLeaks. Sorry, is just, yeah. I'm sure it happened, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in the U.S. State Department who would have loved that there was a right-wing coup. But I mean, it doesn't take an awfully high level of knowledge about what actually happened at the time to see that, it wasn't ordered by Victoria Nuland. I mean, just on a kind of colloquial basis, there were 200,000 people out on the streets. But what's very important to add is that it was 2 weeks and it was Ukrainian winter. I mean, it's really cold. It's -10, -15. We know what CIA inspired plots look like. There are a small number of armed people in a rather chaotic country somewhere, usually in Latin America, right, who are well motivated, well organized, and they take advantage of the chaos to step in. I mean, it's patently clear that that's not what happened. The 200,000 people out on the streets in the middle of winter, and the regional demonstration. Somebody mentioned Volodymyr Ishchenko. I mean, I blow hot and cold with his. I think his research, his sociological research, is very good. I am less enthusiastic about his interpretation. He's somebody I've known for a long time. We've had our very strong disagreements about the interpretation. But I mean, one of the things his research showed is the very, very high level of activity, because one of the things is, it was all in Kiev. Well, clearly it wasn't all in Kiev. And I think some of Volodymyr's research has shown that very, very clearly. This is a real mass event. So again, it's about, do Ukrainians have agency? And clearly this kind of Victoria Nuland theory of history is that, they don't. I mean, you can still read on the internet about how the Russian Revolution of 1917 was cooked up by half a dozen agents of Germany. I mean, let's move on. Okay. So Virginia asked about the migrants. The short answer is I don't know the details. I know that there was not they didn't have what they wanted, which was the association agreement with the EU. That was what the argument was about with Yanukovych. There's very good research on this, again, by scholars. Virginia, if you want to send me an email, I'll dig it out. There are people who've worked on this. Now, so just very quickly, some of the other questions. I think, I mean, I totally agree with Cheryl and with Ted. The issue of what does the right to resist mean, and how do we theorize in the 21st century the question of national self-determination and so on. I mean, to me, it's a question. And I'm not going to try and answer it now. I think, because it's I've tried to work it out and been discussing it with friends and comrades, and I don't have any simple answers to that. I think I have some answers to Linda's question. What was Russia playing at, right? What was the aim of this whole thing? So firstly, I do not think that there was an economic issue here, neither in 2014 nor in 2022. I do not think that the annexation of Crimea or the support for the militants in Donbass brought any economic advantage to the Russian Federation. On the contrary, actually, I mean, because I was doing that work for the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, it's a job that involved speaking with business people in Ukraine and Russia a lot. And every single one of the Russian business people I was in touch with at that time, or had a conversation with at some conference or whatever, they hated it because it was clear that they were going to get sanctioned if they went ahead in the way that they did with the annexation of Crimea. And that was a disaster from the point of view of Russian business, right? So there was a real collision between the short-term economic interests of Russian capital, which at that point was to try to, build on the to start building the recovery from the 08-09 financial crisis and get their businesses back operating and get back into some kind of sync with Western business, and the political aims, which were to do with corralling Russians and to do with the fact that I think in the end, you know, this is another point, the Russian Empire cannot live without Ukraine. I think that's politically, and that's why we've had all this stuff about the Russian world and how Ukrainians are really Russians and so on. I think I've answered a lot of the questions. I'll put my email in the chat. I would plead with you, Cheryl, obviously your choice, but I see that Dennis, who is in or at least from Ukraine, I don't know where he is now. I think he's in Ukraine, but I hope you'll let him come in because that would be good.
No, absolutely. Yes. Simon, the other Simon, wanted to say some, I'm not sure, comments, but
yes,
Dennis, go ahead.
Dennis, but maybe Dennis first because he's Ukrainian, so I think he's gonna have some more interesting stuff than I will.
Okay, Dennis, wherever you are.
I can wait. Don't worry.
Okay. So I'm Dennis Pilash from Social Movement, a socialist group in Ukraine, and I am now in Ukraine. And I wanted to comment on some of the answers or some of the questions that were put. For instance, about that Simon mentioned, but hadn't elaborated about the migrant question. So actually, up to this signing of EU association agreement with by Ukraine, Ukrainians had no status in European countries, and this made their employment much more difficult. So actually, we had millions of people who were forced to leave the country because there was no job after the industrialization and economic collapse.
Dennis, your audio is very weak.
Okay.
Can you speak directly into your microphone or something so that we can hear you?
Yes, I'll try. So
thank you.
Yes, we had millions of people who had to leave the country to work abroad because of the deindustrialization processes and the general economic collapse of the 90s. And I'm personally from the Carpathians. That was the region that was mentioned by Shimon, that actually not only Hungarians, ethnic Hungarians got Hungarian passports, but also non-Hungarians here, just in order to get legal jobs in the European Union countries. And this is one of the material issues that were driving the people for supporting this association agreement with the EU. But in general, there were also lots of other grievances that I would say were very common for all these protests and uprisings that we see this wave after the 2008 economic crisis throughout the world. I think the most iconic were probably the Arab Spring, but we had different mobilizations throughout the world, and Ukraine was no exception. So people were driving by lots of social, economic, political issues. And when people just invoke Victoria Nuland to explain what happened in Ukraine, well, it's so lame, because actually you should know, none of these people know, for instance, the name of Ihor Indila, who was a student who was killed in a police department, or the name of the village Vradiivka, where a bunch of men, including a policeman, raped and killed the women. And this, all this added to, for instance, a general mood against the police violence here. And so that dispersal of first Maidan protest, the so-called student protest, that was the last drop, and it was so powerful, this reaction from the people, precisely because the issue of police violence was, and in many cases still is, very pressuring in Ukraine. And then we had the 16th January laws that effectively outlawed any kind of independent activity, including that on behalf of grassroots organizations and unions. And it was the way, paving the way to something like Lukashenko's authoritarian regime in Belarus. And in some way, it was a point of no return that forced many people, including on the left, to support the protest because there was no other option. The other option was becoming a Russia-controlled, very authoritarian state. And we can see that Russian imperialism, it really acts as some kind of new gendarme of Europe, not so much of Europe, but as a post-Soviet state, and actually suppressing protests, popular protests in Belarus and Kazakhstan, but also beyond, and supporting lots of authoritarian regimes like the Myanmar dictatorship, butchering 1,000 people. Even the most recent example, the Rajapaksa clan in Sri Lanka, there were two institutions they were turning for financial and political support recently, and that was the IMF and Russia. So Russian imperialism is an agent on its own, and it's just as bad as any other imperialism. So it's really, for many people, the Western left, they are really trapped into this America-centric kind of worldview that denies the existence of any other imperialisms, or sees them as something that is like a counterweight to their own, and so it's the lesser evil. But actually, it's a continuation, and it's quite important to be consistent and to be against all imperial aggressions, be it Russia in Ukraine or Erdogan against the Kurds, or Saudi Arabia. Now I think Biden is coming to Saudi Arabia. So it's a very legitimate way to protest the American imperialism. But just to consent to reduce the Russian aggression against Ukraine to some kind of proxy war, it's like calling the Vietnam War. It was a proxy war of US against China and the USSR. And just denying that was the war of extermination of Vietnamese people by the US imperialism. And this is the same situation because it's an existential threat for Ukrainian working class and Ukrainian people in general. The Russian occupation and the Russian warfare, it means in many cases the physical destruction of the people. And then the occupation means also no way to provide any kind of legal activity. So Simon knows a lot about what was the situation with unions in the Russia-controlled parts of Donbass, and in general of some kind of independent entities. They were all crushed, suppressed, and there is no room for their existence. So this is really an issue that is that people here are forced to resist because there is also no other option. So that's why it's so important to have an understanding and to have a solidarity, because actually all the struggles we are facing here, they go beyond just the Ukrainian context. And in order to have a world that will be more equal, more free, more solidary, more just, we cannot just turn a blind eye to other imperialisms' wrongdoings. So it has to be resisted as well as your own. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you very, very much for those comments, Denis. Simon, the other Simon from Simon M, would you like to? So we're going to wrap up here.
Yeah.
You go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Very briefly, a few technicalities, because one about the things Simon was saying about, because when he was talking first, he was saying about the like the other struggles as well, like Palestinian and all. I'll send the link of Congress of the Polish left-wing party Razem, which they had organized a panel with Ukrainians, but also Palestinians from the BDS movement and the Kurdish Turkish HDP party. So I will show you the ways how they link the struggles together. That's the first thing. And the second one is about your intervention in the discussion, because you said about the rape. It's a very good point. And in the European Network of Solidarity with Ukraine, we have two manifestos about the situation. One is organized by, I send the links as well, one by the Ukrainian feminists with the help of Ensu, about the self-determination and right to struggle, the military struggle. So I'll send the links, and if any of you want to sign or give it to other feminist organization or any groups who would willing to sign in the US, that will be good. And the second one is about the abortion rights. In especially it consists the ones in Poland, because as many of you may know, in Poland abortion is very restricted, and we have the biggest groups of migrants, of refugees, Ukrainian women, which have like in the peak time it was about 3 million people. Now it's less because some of them are in other European countries, some came back to Ukraine, but still it's over like maybe 2 million people, mostly women. So and the problem of abortion is really big, and the organization called Aborcja bez granic, Abortion Without Borders, just got financial help from the French government recently, just for organizing abortions abroad, or the pharmacological abortions for Ukrainian women refugees. So I'll send the links for both of the manifestos. So if any of you want to sign, or any organization you know which one is signed, we'll be very grateful for that. And there was the question from Virginia about the migrants, and Dennis partially talked about it, but I would say from the Polish perspective, there was like even without just about 214, 215, there was about thousands of Ukrainians working in Poland, and even before the war, it was about 1 million workers in Poland, Ukrainian workers. So you have to see that, and Poland was not the only country which Ukrainians came. You talked about Spain, but the country with big Ukrainian migrant and workers community is Portugal, which not everyone knows, and there's also Germany. So there was, even if they didn't have the abilities like being the part of the EU, there was, like for example, in Poland, they had, they were able to work thanks to the agreement between Poland and Ukraine. So it was like a country-to-country agreement, not the, it doesn't have anything to do with EU at that point. So that's about the migrants situation. I think that's about it for now. Maybe I'll think about something later.
So as I said at the beginning of the meeting, we will have another forum, a panel discussion or presentation in a few weeks on, some people call it the Brown-Red Alliance. We are calling it the influence of fascist ideas amongst the left, Stalinist ideas in the left to this day, and how that's especially influenced the situation in Ukraine and the left's position on it. So I think with that, we are going to close this meeting. And again, thank you to everyone who participated, and thank you. Ted's raising his hand. Thank you, Simon, for your presentation. So as I said at the beginning of the meeting, we will have another forum, a panel discussion or presentation in a few weeks on, some people call it the Brown-Red Alliance. We are calling it the influence of fascist ideas amongst the left, Stalinist ideas in the left to this day, and how that's especially influenced the situation in Ukraine and the left's position on it. So I think with that, we are going to close this meeting. And again, thank you to everyone who participated, and thank you. Ted's raising his hand. Thank you, Simon, for your presentation. Ted, did you want to say something? You